also about the erasure of Palestinian voices. It's also about the erasure of Palestinian stories, the complete deletion, right, of Palestine from the landmass, from the map, and from ultimately the political imaginary.
The Electronic Intifada.
The Electronic Intifada.
The Electronic Intifada.
This is the Electronic Intifada podcast. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman.
And I'm Asa and Tamara.
Today on the Electronic Intifada podcast, we're talking about what happened in late April when major tech companies yet again shut down an event featuring the Palestinian resistance icon Leila Khaled and others, this time at UC Merced. And the university has so far refused to challenge the censorship by these private corporations. We're joined today by Omar Zahzah. They're a member of USACBI, the U.S. Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, and the Palestinian Youth Movement, and they've been following this issue for a while. Also with us is Saliem Shehadeh, a grad student at UCLA and a former student at San Francisco State. Omar and Saliem, thank you so much for being with us today on the Electronic Intifada podcast.
Thank you for having us.
So bring us up to date on what happened in late April at UC Merced. Earlier, 7 months ago, in September of 2020, Zoom, YouTube, and Facebook deleted and would not allow, the pre-event page and then the event itself to go ahead. And this was an event with Leila Khaled, Ronnie Kasrils, and other members of anti-apartheid activist movements, scholars. Talk about what happened just, a week or so ago, and the kind of the general atmosphere of like these Silicon Valley tech companies being able to censor events at public universities.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe, Omar, I'll start here. So my connection to San Francisco State, yes, I graduated back in 2017, but I've stayed on board as part of the Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diasporas program, working with Dr. Abab Abdelhadi. So the events that you're referencing started back in the fall. They actually have an earlier history, and I guess I'll mention it briefly to get into how it formed, is that we have a series of open classrooms under the title of Teaching Palestine at San Francisco State University in the Ahmed program under Dr. Abdelhadi. So she incorporates it as part of the Ahmed curriculum, as part of her scholarship and public advocacy and all these different works. And she collaborates in the Teaching Palestine project with other activists, scholars, you name it, right? And one of these iterations was a joint program with Dr. Tomomi Kinakawa from Women and Gender Studies at San Francisco State University. And there were a series of events that were put together, and the students absolutely loved it. So the event that was supposed to take place in September of 2020 was under the umbrella of critical women and gender studies, mixing it with Ahmed studies as part and parcel of like what Ahmed studies does. And it wasn't the first collaboration that they had done. They'd done others in the past. This was the first that was targeted by the Zionist pressures and by the resulting, huge tech companies. And kind of what happened in the fall also happened in last week, where first we produce the flyer, we send it out, there's noise being made about it, people are signing up. I believe in September we had over 1,500 people sign up before Zoom canceled the event. And what happened was a lot of these Zionist organizations started just absolutely smearing the event, smearing Leila Khaled, smearing Dr. Abdelhadi, smearing the Ahmed program for putting it together. And they started writing letters to everybody, right? So they would send letters to San Francisco State, they would send letters to Zoom, they would send letters to Facebook, they would send letters to the congressional members, they would send letters to, you name it. They were writing op-eds. They were going all out. When we ended up finding out that among one of the strategies they've taken is that there's this like this app called ACT-IL. And essentially what it is it gets this huge database of people or huge listserv of people you just click a button and then it auto sends whatever.
Right. They call them missions. Yeah.
Yeah. And so
yeah.
I believe there were, I think the last figure we saw on it was about 19,000 kind of active users engaged in the Leila Khaled event. It's a Who's Narrative event. So 19,000 people on the ACT-IL website were sending in all these, missions, as you said. And it had an impact, right? So what ended up happening first was Zoom's lawyers contacts the CSU systems lawyers, and then it goes down the chain of command, if you will, because these universities are corporate structures at this point, public or not, right? And it goes to the provost of San Francisco State University, then sends a joint email to Dr. Abdulhadi and Dr. Kinakawa. Actually, I don't know if it's the same email or in the same thread or two emails, but in any case, the provost sends the email informing them that Zoom's lawyers has contacted the CSU and informing them of the allegations that of material support for terrorism, and suggests that both of them seek legal counsel. Not that the university is going to provide the legal counsel, that they seek independent legal counsel. Okay, so multiple issues going on. One, right. It's the fear tactic. It's the, we're accusing you of material support for terrorism. The second is you better lawyer up. And the third is we're not going to provide you that lawyer. Okay. And so kind of then there's a large, the legal attacks against Palestine scholars and activists is not new. So there's a body, right? People are aware of these situations. So, the call was made for legal support. There were, a number of, activist lawyers got on board and began kind of interpreting the matter. And they said, listen, like, there is absolutely no crime being done. This is meritless. These accusations are absolutely meritless. And not only that, the material support clause is in and of itself like, this egregious, relic of the USA Patriot Act, right? And we know the terrible things that the USA Patriot Act has done, right? It's not a good thing, to say the least, right? It has led to mass incarceration, mass surveillance, mass policing, mass death. I mean, it's, these things are being used as kind of legitimizing of kind of the violent apparatus of the state force, which, Omar, you can talk more about. But in any case, so they're trying to bring it here. So the university's response was San Francisco State, and I say this because UC Merced followed the pattern exactly. The academic approach was that this is academic freedom. We will let the event go on, with caveat, because the other academic approach was we don't agree with their speech. Their speech is anti-Semitic. Their speech is hatred, but we're going to protect the speech. And this is the same thing that they do with white supremacy on campus, right? It's the same. And so in that one stroke, they say they're going to protect our academic freedom and people congratulate them for it, but at what cost? Because they're saying that these people are terrorists, these people are terrorist supporters, and these people are anti-Semite, but we're going to accept them nonetheless, right? So it completely inappropriate response in terms of how they conceptualize our narratives, right, and what we were teaching. On top of that, what the university then did was held a vigil for Jewish students to discuss anti-Semitism, where they invited, I think, like ADL, Campus Hallel, I believe the Israeli consulate also was part of it. The university provost was provost. The president spoke and the provost office, as well as the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Office co-sponsored this event, right? So essentially, the university is pushing that line: is that we hate what they're saying, we hate what these Palestinians are saying. We hate, don't support the Palestinians. But we're going to let it happen because we're so, whatever they want to call themselves, right?
Committed to free
and
speech, allegedly.
Right.
free, yeah, while they're smearing us and basically putting us in the same box as white supremacists.
They're delegitimizing you is what they're doing.
Right.
Exactly. And so then what happened was we decided to push the university on many fronts, but one of the fronts was to say, give us an alternative platform. Okay. We said, if we were in person and let's say, a water pipe breaks in the building, you're going to relocate my classroom. You're going to give me another classroom. Okay. We don't agree with what Zoom said about shutting down our event, because they did shut down the event the morning of. But we're going to say, give us an alternative platform that has the same capacities, that can reach the 1,500 people, that all the The university's response was, we don't have the technological capacity to do that. You can't use, they're contracted with I think Microsoft Teams. You can't use Teams for San Francisco's policies. You can't use Teams for course instruction. Yeah, it's not intended for that. It's intended for like team building or whatever. So they said, why don't you use your personal Microsoft Skype account? Use your personal Skype account, and then go ahead and get a third-party system, or download a third-party software integrated into the Skype, your personal Skype, that would allow for streaming, and then stream it to your personal, social media site like Facebook or whatever. And we're like, listen, this is the morning of the event. What? Yeah. I don't know how to integrate third-party software to allow Skype to go and I don't know how to do this, right? Do it for us. They can't do it for us because it's not technically. Then they say, well, they can't do it because it's not technically San Francisco property, because it's not San Francisco software, right? So now it becomes outside of the bounds of the AT. So now they've done their duty by giving us alternative but then they also have done it in a way that they actually don't have to provide any support whatsoever, because they don't own any of the software rights to the things that they've just suggested to us. So now basically they've done nothing, right? They've done nothing to help us. And so what we ended up doing was, we're like, okay, we're just going to go, we ended up buying another software out of our own pocket that had these things integrated, and StreamYard. And what we ended up doing was using that to then go through Facebook and YouTube channel. And we got all of our morning of, we're texting everybody, can we get your login information? You're a co-host of this event. Can we go ahead and broadcast on your YouTube channel, on your Facebook? Everybody, right? All these different orgs. Everybody's like, yes, go, do it. We start 23 minutes into it. They just shut it down.
I remember
they
that.
Pull it from Facebook. Yeah. They pull it from YouTube. They pull it from all these different things. Till this day. So then what ended up happening was, we got all these warnings, right? Facebook sent me all these warnings. YouTube didn't even send a warning. YouTube froze us. Like, it's been months. Till this day, I can the Ahmed YouTube channel is frozen. I cannot live stream on the YouTube channel on Ahmed for 6 months and more. And what was interesting was, we went through every process. So we got the notification. I appealed it. The appeal was denied. Then we went through, and they said that their judgment is that they're going to freeze our live stream for, I think, like 30 days or some period of time. The day after, I went in, tried the live stream, nothing. 6 months later, tried live, nothing. They've even, what they've told us they're going to do isn't even what they've done. They've just been a perpetual freeze. So now what they did, fast forward to last week, is we went through the same process. We're like, okay, we'll do the same thing we did last time. We'll go on Facebook. We can't use YouTube, but we'll go on our Facebook page. We didn't want to use Zoom, but we wanted to have some sort of kind of like place where we could kind of collect names, so that we could email them saying, go to this link. Eventbrite shut us down. We tried the UC Merced Zoom first. UC Merced's Zoom account shut us down. And I'll go back to this because there was a new contract that Zoom signed with the UC that should have actually prevented this.
Right.
But it actually shouldn't have, because the way that they structured it was intentional, so that when it came about Palestine again, they could censor it. So it wasn't, they did it to protect other issues, but when it came to Palestine, it was strategic in that they wrote in an exception so they could literally do this again. But anyway, Eventbrite got taken down, Zoom got taken down, Facebook, now our whole channel on Facebook is gone. Like, it's not like frozen, like it's not like we can't even edit it, like it's gone. Like, they deleted it, they unpublished it. So that means the years of archive that we have on the Facebook channel is gone. And you're like, well, why would an academic program use Facebook as a academic archive? Like, that doesn't, like, what do you, that's what it's come to, when the sense that there has been years and years and years and years of attacks and undermining of the Ahmed program and Dr. Lahadi, where in order for us to get our content out there, in order for us to actually like use things that are like to reach, you know, our audiences, reach, you know, those who are part of our classrooms, is we went to social media. So we would have a webinar, we'd have an event, and this is even pre-COVID, right? We'd do an event online. So because there are people from across the world who watch these things, right? It's not just, you know, those who have access to San Francisco State on a 9-to-5 schedule. Like, we're like, no, like that's not the way the world works, right? So years of video archives just removed, taken down, unpublished, gone. And so now there's a push to get Facebook to reinstate the Ahmed page, not only so that we can kind of reach our audiences again through that platform, but also to preserve, to get back the archive that's now gone. I mean, interviews, webinars, everything gone. Omar, did you want to?
Well, maybe Omar, you can talk a little bit about the Zoom guidelines that Saliem just mentioned, and the caveat that they inserted in there for Palestine-related issues. Yeah, that's significant. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, you know, what's interesting about this whole thing is, you know, the initial reason given for not letting the event proceed, as Saliem mentioned, was, you know, Leila Khaled's presence, you know, and her affiliation with a quote unquote known terrorist organization, right? In reality, you know, again, for the reasons Saliem mentioned, like this argument and application of potential material support charges and enforcement of censorship based on that is completely baseless, because, you know, the event itself is Whose Narratives, Gender, Justice, and Liberation. So, you know, Leila Khaled, along with all the other panelists, is coming to talk about the interconnection between, you know, anti-colonial liberation, gender justice, and liberation, and ultimately the interconnections across different movements for anti-colonial liberation throughout history, right? But secondly, you know, because these things were ultimately baseless at the legal level, what had happened was Zoom had crossed this Rubicon where they became ultimately the content censor of, you know, academic speech, of academic programming. And that's why I think, you know, in September after this happened, you had a big mobilization, obviously, from those of us, you know, in the Palestine movement, Palestine Solidarity movement, who were trying to promote it and talk about it as much as we could. But you also had places like the AAUP talking about how this is a huge infringement on academic speech, because what you had was a private tech company saying what can and cannot be allowed to, you know, to proceed as pedagogical material, right? Which is a very, very dangerous precedent to set. Now, the other kind of, you know, sort of frustrating irony of all of this is that, you know, as this initially, when it seemed like the UC Merced event might be allowed to proceed, you know, maybe there was a day or so where there was a bit of uncertainty about that. You know, it seemed like, okay, maybe finally there's a realization that some kind of, you know, something has been transgressed. This was an overstep. We can kind of go back to the days of no more content moderation. And indeed, Zoom released a statement saying we're going to refrain from content moderation when it comes to, you know, academic programming. But, you know, they had 3 caveats actually, and I actually have them right in front of me.
Yeah.
So what they said was Zoom will only act on reports alleging content-related violations of our community standards or terms of service that come from the meeting's hosts or the account owners. So it'll only act on content-related violations unless 3 points. The first point, Zoom determines there is legal or regulatory risk to Zoom if it does not act. Point 2, the report alleges an immediate threat to the physical safety of any person Or point three, the meeting or webinar is unrelated to the institution's academics or operations. And to me in particular, the third one is especially astounding because this is Zoom assuming the authority to say what is and is not relevant to an academic institution, right? So, again, I can't say enough. I really think we should not decenter Palestine from this because this is first and foremost about Palestine. But the implications of this, I think, are very, very staggering because we are in a moment where private tech companies, profit-driven private tech companies have taken it upon themselves to directly censor a classroom and give themselves the authority to do that, right? And lastly, I think the interconnection to the deletion of the Ahmed Studies Facebook page, as Saliem mentioned, also on April 13th, is very important when we think of the question of Palestine, because, as the Zionist colonization of Palestine, obviously it's about the elimination of Palestinians. It's about the physical removal of Palestinians and ethnic cleansing, but it's also about the erasure of Palestinian voices. It's also about the erasure of Palestinian stories, the complete deletion, right, of Palestine from the landmass, from the map, and from ultimately the political imaginary. And so what's happening now as these technologies become more streamlined, as the forces of surveillance, capitalism, and for-profit white supremacy become more and more entrenched, they are directly acting on this imperative, in sort of ways that utilize new technology for the same kind of violent means of resistance and erasure, of those who resist erasure, I should say.
Let's talk a little bit about how, maybe people don't grasp enough the significance of these private corporations being able to be arbiters of what can and cannot be taught or talked about in academic settings. And if Zoom and Facebook and YouTube continue to get away with this and be so, they capitulate so easily to, the Israeli government, for example, which funds that app that Saliem was talking about earlier, act.il, Israel lobby groups here in the US, and lawmakers who, are allied with Israel lobby organizations. Like if that becomes kind of a standard, what does that mean for other liberation movements and other topics that, that might not be favorable to these corporate tech giants?
Yeah, so I would say, and then Saliem, if you'd like to add, feel free to jump in. But for me, it's really going to be a domino effect. What we've seen from this new statement that Zoom released is they've already effectively codified their ability to decide what is and isn't relevant to academic programming. So, and I think really we're going to see, sort of an ongoing policing, repression, and silencing of genuine anti-colonial knowledge production, right? And what's I think so important about a project like Ahmed Studies and about the collaborations that Ahmed Studies has had with programs like Women and Gender Studies program at San Francisco State and all of the amazing panelists is that also that this was free, right? But let's not forget that this was programming that was open to anybody who just wanted to see it, who wanted to learn, who wanted to hear about these histories. So, when I say anti-colonial programming and pedagogy, I don't just mean, in content, something that talks about a history of liberation. It's also something that tries to realize through praxis, right? Kind of challenge the stranglehold that private companies have, that copyrights have, that all of these forces that try to really instill a kind of intellectual and educational apartheid in the larger culture at large, challenging that through a praxis that's also anti-colonial. I think we're going to continue to see a repression and a policing of that. If anything, efforts like this need to be lauded and they need to be seen as really at the forefront of challenging, the ongoing privatization of, intellectual work, of education and of academia, but I definitely think, it's not going to bode well for anything that is inherently anti-colonial, in its bent moving forward. So I definitely think now is the time more than ever for all of us who profess to have anti-colonial ethos to do any kind of work that is sufficiently challenging Palestinian colonization, the colonization of Black and Indigenous peoples all across the world. The time is now to really stand against this repression.
Yeah, Saliem, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just think that also when we're talking about like what's happening in the classroom is that it is a fight to even have those classrooms in the first place, right? And I think that this is what's, you know, when we're talking about these private companies and as Omar, you were talking about the privatization of the university, is that Ahmed started in 2006, 2007. And when Dr. Blahedi came, she signed, a memorandum of understanding, part of like her hiring contract with the university, that she would come with 3 faculty members that the university would hire to build up the Ahmed program, because we understand that one person is not a program. It cannot be, right? You need a body, you need a collective to constitute a program. We're in 2021. She's the only professor in Ahmed studies. We have a few lecturers, sometimes, other times they fire lecturers at a heart in a second, right? Which happened, especially, which has been happening over time, right? So why I say this is because, like, for instance, they just cut Ahmed summer classes. There are not going to be, the university has officially cut the Ahmed classes for the summer, right? So now when we're talking about what Zoom is doing to censor a webinar, it's very important, but it's part of the larger web of what the universities are doing, right? They have essentially like they've defunded the Ahmed Studies program. They've refused to hire tenure track faculty members. In 2009, we were so close to getting a tenure track faculty member. Searches went out for the hire. Then what ended up happening, there was a joint event of the Edward Said mural that we have at San Francisco State. And part of the mural celebration was GUPS, the General Union of Palestine Students, invited Omar Barghouti to come and give remarks at the ceremony. The Zionists attacked the event. And by attack, I mean they smeared the event. They smeared Omar Barghouti, they smeared the Ahmed program, they smeared Dr. Blahedi, they smeared GUPS. The university president, Robert Corrigan at the time, his response was to cut the searches for the hires in 2009 under the pretext that it was because of the 2008 economic crash, that the university was cash strapped and they could no longer afford hiring a new professor. Supposedly, this was over 10 years ago. There was an economic recovery. Position was never reassigned. That's not these are not financial decisions that they're making. These are political decisions that they're using the finance to legitimize their decisions. This is the same thing they did with COVID. Under COVID, they cut Ahmed classes by 66%, the course offerings. What courses that Dr. Blahedi taught as the only professor of the department, they ended up forcibly she had to teach courses outside of the Ahmed program for the first time. They forced her to teach classes outside of the Ahmed program in the fall. Like, she's the only Ahmed professor. Now she can't even teach an Ahmed class. She has to teach a different class. And then what they ended up doing was they're firing all the lecturers that we had lined up. They're not allowing the program to grow. And so when we're talking about kind of like they're canceling a classroom, yes, it's significant, it's huge. The implications, I'm not trying to diminish them, they're huge, but they're part and parcel of the fact that they're also canceling entire courses, canceling entire programs. Like, we know that by the way, like just to kind of finish the narrative here, California governor issued a statement saying that all university funding will be restored to 2020, 2021, or 2020 levels, essentially saying that the huge financial kind of divestment it's not divestment, what's it called? I mean, they were deficit, projecting us. Yeah, definitely. Well, they were trying to undertake yet more austerity measures, right? Defund public spending and all this stuff. So he said that actually they're reversing course and they're not going to defund the university. They're going to restore the funding. So they're going to restore all the classes. They haven't done that. And as I said, even though they announced that they're restoring all the funding, the Ahmed summer classes are gone. It cut them from the books, right? So there are talks about how we can kind of respond to that. I'm not going to go into because they're not done yet, but we may do something kind of outside of the outside. We may not. I don't know. I don't want to go into it yet because there's still so many decisions. But like even one of the things that we were actually discussing before getting on the call was like one of the options that we had was, okay, they canceled the formal official online summer classes. We can do open classes on Facebook because we've known about this before they canceled. Well, now they canceled the Facebook page. Now we can't even do that. Do you see? Like it's so embedded. So I mean, yeah, I'll just stop there. But I think that I also wanted to, actually I won't, because I wanted to talk about the UC's academic Senate, because they have taken action. Yeah.
Right. So the UC, University of California, is separate from CSU, which is the California State University System. And SF State, just for our listeners and viewers, SF State is part of the California State University System. UC Merced is part of the University of California. So yeah. Talk about what the University of California did recently.
Yeah. And I think that it's significant because the first thing that happened is and one thing I wanted to say about the way the UCs operate is that they operate as one university with multiple campuses. Right. So this is their logic, right? So like it's the University of California and then the various like Berkeley, LA, Riverside, Davis, all of them, right? So Merced. So what they do is they have these like joint committees and councils. So the University Committee on Academic Freedom, this is like the university-wide, issued a statement and to their subcommittee of the Academic Senate. So that committee issued a statement to the whole Academic Senate. And in it, I just want to read their concluding paragraph where they say, as UCAF, so the University of California Academic Freedom, has said before, and it's quote, the university's responsibility to protect academic freedom and freedom of expression cannot be outsourced, close quote. Taking the legal steps necessary to provide clarity about what kinds of academic activities the law allows is ultimately the university's responsibility, not that of Zoom or any other private company. And another section is our faculty and students, quote, should not be required to await and undergo criminal prosecution to know whether their academic activities are protected by the First Amendment or criminalized under the material support law. And this is key. They're basically saying to the provost of the university, how dare you? Like, how dare you take these steps that essentially move forward as if these students are engaging in these criminal, which they're not. In fact, nobody is, right? Nobody's doing that. That's not even a question that the lawyers are entertaining. The lawyers, legal counsel that we've discussed, that this is ridiculous, right? So I want to make that very clear. These are meritless accusations. But despite their meritlessness, they are still being operated on by university officials and corporate officials as if they are fact, and they are not. And that is what's kind of underpinning all of this, is they are moving forward as if we have already committed a crime when no crime has been committed, right? And that's not new, right? We know that this is the unfortunate reality of how our societies, how power operates in our society, right? And as Omar, you were talking about, and I think you can talk more about, but what ended up happening was then the Academic Senate took the statement that the Academic Freedom Committee issued, and they forwarded it to they forwarded it with their own statement. So they added another statement, and they sent it to Michael Drake, the president of the University of California. And in it, they lay out the concerns. They lay out all of the concerns that have been presented by the Academic Freedom Committee, and they are pushing now the university president, UC president, to take action to prevent these sorts of things from happening again. At not only the accusations of criminal activity but also the censorship. So the two parts here. And might as we add that these accusations are rooted in Islamophobia. I mean, they're this is very self-evident, right? The accusation of Islamophobia is sufficient to mark one as, the accusation of terrorism is enough to mark one as terrorism, right? You are guilty upon accusation. Like, why? Because our names are, the Ahmed program. Like, it's anyway.
Right. And yeah, I mean, the University of California and most other university systems and administrations have been, very quick to do these preemptive censorship acts because they're scared of losing federal funding. Because Israel lobby groups, threaten them with all sorts of litigation. They say that, for example, if you have a Palestine-centered event on campus, it could make some Jewish students feel uncomfortable and therefore would violate Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, over discrimination. In completely baseless accusations that have been thrown out by the Department of Education when they've been when these complaints have been filed. But nonetheless, these university administrations are very scared of litigation. They listen to their donors first. And they're very happy to kind of accommodate Israel lobby requests. Even when it comes to censoring their own members of faculty. And it's phenomenal. With that said, how are academics and students fighting back, and what is the recourse, after the event in September, and now just, very recently at UC Merced?
Omar, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah, I'll get it started, and then if there's anything I leave out, feel free to jump in. I mean, definitely, we've seen. So what happened after September, for example, there was there was a sort of a USACBI kind of week of action, where basically universities all over the country sort of staged their own open classrooms, along with a video, of Leila Khaled basically challenging this, and on Zoom. The point is, do it on Zoom, sort of challenge the censorship. And several were censored, as I believe even Electronic Intifada reported, right? You saw that New York University, I think, was one of the most prominent ones. And so, which was interesting because, on the one hand, they're solidarity events, but they also show that this is kind of an ongoing campaign, right? But at least I think, in a sense, there was something in the public record, that was happening. There were academic organizations who signed on to statements basically protesting, this is a violation of academic speech. You had AAUP coming out, when really criticizing, what Zoom and what tech companies were doing. And so I think, really academically, there was a movement of recognizing the larger significance of what was happening. Well, I should say the specific and larger significance, because I think both contexts should not be displaced. So I think the mobilization on this, and also, you had organizations like the FIRE, which, I think politically is a little bit back and forth, but ultimately they did defend this as, being very much a First Amendment. Exactly.
Organization, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think that, there was kind of a strength in that mobilization because, it really allowed for something that a lot of different forces and organizations could plug into. Meanwhile, as Palestinian and Palestinian-led organizations, we also sort of tried to challenge this, as directly a violation or an attack really upon Palestinian peoplehood, Palestinian identity. And collectivities, such as the Palestine Feminist Working Group, released an important statement about how this is not just the silencing of, one open classroom. It's not just the silencing of Leila Khaled. It's really, a reinforcement of the patriarchal violence, that Zionism ultimately upholds. So it's not just the silencing of Palestinian voices, it's a silencing of Palestinian feminist voices and narratives. So it's an ongoing kind of symbolic recreation and reinfliction of the very, kind of founding violence that Zionism initiates, with its ethnic cleansing, with its colonization, and with its, machinations of apartheid. So really, this is, at the lexical level, at the symbolic level, the violence of Zionism being reinforced all over again. So I think, while there's a lot of emphasis put into challenging narratives, I think that there is a kind of power in that, because a lot of times what these institutions will rely on is this kind of, our hands are tied, there's an official sort of decree and we just have to follow it. In reality, they don't have to follow anything. They're making their own choices. And so when people push back and say, this is actually not the full story, there's something that's being left out, there's people that are being silenced, then really there's something larger that I think acts on the public imagination. And I think that allows for greater mobilization.
Yeah.
This whole thing just seems really, once again, Palestine is the sort of canary in the coal mine, because it's a complete corporate takeover really on every level. We're supposed to be in the future. We're in the future and we have video phones. But these corporations are just using the new technology and to basically aggregate more power to themselves, So it's a really scary time, really, in a lot of ways. I find it really interesting as well how Act.il has got involved. One of Israel's troll armies, essentially. They're funded. It's a big organization. It is an app, but I think it's almost downplaying it to just describe it as an app, because it's an organization which is founded, which is it's funded to the tune of $1 million a year that we know of, partly by the State of Israel, partly by the Adelsons, the casino billionaires and Israel lobby funders. And it is run and coordinated by Israel's Ministry of Strategic Affairs. So it's very much linked to the State of Israel. It very much pushes the agenda of the State of Israel. So we can see that this is something that, is important for, it's important enough that the State of Israel feels like it's a priority that they should be trying to sabotage. So yeah, there's a lot of issues here that not that people in general should be concerned about, not only Palestine solidarity activists.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. If I can just chime in really quickly, I think that is the other factor, in sort of some of the statements that we tried to put together for support for Ahmed's studies, we did note that this is always tied to Israeli government aligned organizations, but we also know, as you're saying, I believe since 2016, The Intercept was reporting that Facebook was working with the Israeli government to censor Palestinian content, right? And if anything, this idea, the so-called content violations where people are getting their posts taken down, their pages deleted for temporary, usually amounts of time, is only increasing, right? And you saw recently there was the petition from Jewish Voice for Peace, to oppose the word Zionist being included, as sort of interchangeable with Jewish person in Facebook's hate speech policies. And of course, you see reporting from Al-Shabaka about how YouTube has also been collaborating in the censorship, in addition to what we've seen specifically in the case of Ahmed, which I think is very much at the crux of all of this. We know that the Israeli government has been working with tech companies to censor this content for years now. So I think you're right to flag that, and it is very important for people to be aware of, but also to realize that, it's a huge problem when things that should be open source, when things that are supposed to be about communication are really being so regulated both by the profit margin and, by various forces of, colonial supremacy, of white supremacy, and of political repression. I think there's a kind of dialectical nature to social media where people rightly point out that it allowed for a lot of inroads in terms of how you could challenge official narratives. Now you can record yourself. Now you can upload things. Now you can show videos, of things that the state otherwise wants covered up. All that's true. But over the years, I think the companies have also found ways to really refine the profit margin, refine the surveillance margin, and really refine, their hold and their stranglehold on what people can and can't say, on who should and shouldn't be watched and who should and shouldn't be censored. And I think that if we don't fight back, these types of things are only going to become more entrenched, more invasive, and more politically repressive, even than we're seeing now.
Yeah, I think they really are expanding their power because, in previous generations of technology, just telephones, mobile phones, yeah, they were all owned by corporations, but by and large, states still had the power over what can and can't be said over the telephone, within certain margins at least anyway. But now we're reaching the stage where corporations, these massive unaccountable Silicon Valley corporations, are just entrenching more power to themselves, really. So it's very dangerous.
And it's all terms of service. That's the thing. We can't have Leila Khaled because of our quote unquote terms of service. You can't do this class because of our terms of service. Ultimately, what is the political subtext to terms of service? We know what it is. And the more institutions under this neoliberal moment continue to outsource themselves to the private interests of capital and repression, the more we're going to see these types of things. And ultimately, everything is going to become, quotidian as who can and can't say what, to things even more dystopian to, what is and isn't permitted sort of political act.
Right.
If I may say one thing, I think, it has to be said that this is kind of the result of an increased, calls for censorship, which has been supported not only by political elites in the United States, but also the media. And it's, we saw it like a climax during the 2016 US presidential elections, but now you've got like a bipartisan chorus that's begging Silicon Valley overlords to do their authoritarian bidding in the name of fact checking and in the name of, political ads and so on. And even people like, New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have joined these calls. And so it's always, and when you actually look at these oversight boards that, have been hired by, for example, Facebook, you see, at least in Facebook's example, Facebook hired the former Director General of Israel's Justice Ministry in that oversight board that determines what content to censor or permit on its social media platform. And this former Director General, Emmy Palmer, she headed the Justice Ministry when I'm sure you remember, Nora and Asa, when Ayelet Shaked became notorious for making a Facebook post inciting the genocide of Palestinians. And so this is the person that's on the Facebook oversight board.
That's crazy.
I didn't realize
she was. Yeah, I didn't realize she was at that time. Yeah,
it's pretty astonishing. Omar and Saliem, if people want to learn more, especially about AMED studies, the Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diasporas program at San Francisco State, or what's happening, around the UC Merced event, where can people go? It's kind of like, I know that, you've been censored from all of these regular platforms, but how can people kind of stay abreast of what's happening?
Nora, I think you just published an article in Electronic Intifada, so that came out today. So, so there's that's and then there's another article coming out tomorrow, written by Dr. Blahadi, Dr. Malloy, Sean Malloy, who's professor at UC Merced, Dr. Kinakawa, who I discussed, and myself. I believe it's coming out in Mondawai sometime this week, maybe today or tomorrow. Jewish Voice for Peace issued a call to action regarding Facebook. So there's an action alert going around JVP. Maybe we can kind of share the links and it can go on the podcast when you all upload it.
Absolutely.
Regarding Facebook, we so I'll tell you what we did, because this is what happened. Was the week before the event, Facebook had already taken down our Facebook page. Okay, now it says Facebook page, but it was Palestine Prisoners Day, April 17, and we had an event. And what we ended up doing was we worked with our orgs. We worked with kind of orgs that we historically work with, and we used we collaborated on their social media platforms, and we sent out the sent out the live stream on their platforms, like their Facebook page and their YouTube page. And we've done it historically with a number of different orgs. It's not just that one time. Like, when even, a lot of our webinars, like, for instance, Omar, you're part of PYM. PYM has hosted a number of these things. Eyewitness Palestine, National SJP, Samizun, like a lot of different orgs kind of like will also use their presence to do that. That may be the route that we have to take in the immediate future until we can get our Facebook page back. Because mind you, it's not just the Facebook page they took down. They also took down our YouTube page months ago. So what we have left is we have a Twitter page. So you can follow us on Twitter, Ahmed Studies. And we have I believe Instagram. And I believe Instagram's also owned by Facebook. The irony is that they didn't take down the Instagram page, but they took down the Facebook page. Okay. Which also raises something that Omar was talking about earlier about Leila Khaled actually spoke on Zoom a week after our event in September. I think she spoke October 1st or something like that. So Dr. Abdulahi always asks, what happened between September 23rd and October 1st, where Zoom said that she was, a terrorist and couldn't speak on September 23rd, but she wasn't a terrorist on October 1st and she could speak? Like, what kind of ridiculousness is this, right? So I think part of why I also want to raise that is the attacks are not accidental. They are going after the Ahmed program and they are going after Dr. Abdulhadi. Like this is not the first time that they have attacked and undermined the program. Let's not forget they filed 2 lawsuits against San Francisco State because naming the actions of the Ahmed program, Dr. Abdulhadi, and GUPS as primary grievances, if you will, that they filed in the lawsuit. One was in federal court, one was in state court. One, Dr. Abdulhadi was named explicitly as she was the only faculty member who was named in the lawsuit. Like she had to get a lawyer because they targeted her in the lawsuit, right? Everybody else was university administrators. She was the only one that was a university faculty that was named. So let's not forget, like they're going after her, right? Yeah. They're going after her because of her Palestine advocacy work. So yeah, I mean, we're fighting the good fight. We're pushing back. We're trying to get our platforms back. We're trying to use alternative platforms. The thing is that we shouldn't be excluded from these spaces, which is what we're all talking about now. These companies shouldn't have the authority that they have. But we're also talking about these companies are rotten to the core, right? It's not like if once they restore the Ahmed Facebook page that we're all going to donate. No, Facebook is rotten. Google, Alphabet, they're rotten. Like these things, these corporations, these monopolies, they're not good, right? So we can talk more and more about that, but it's not that like once we get it, everything's no. The fight continues. But in the meantime, we demand our page back. We demand our archive back. We demand, this is a platform that people use, right? Hopefully Facebook is a passing phenomenon, right? As as Dr. Abdulhadi always says, Zionism is a passing phenomenon. Hopefully, colonial, empires have come and gone, right?
Yeah.
The Roman Empire fell, right? So, so it's these things don't last forever. So in the meantime, we're sticking it out.
Well, thank you. And we will put all of those links on the podcast post that accompanies this podcast on the Electronic Intifada. Omar, Zahzah, and Saliem Shehadeh, thank you so much for all of your work and for being with us on the Electronic Intifada podcast. And we'll, of course, update our listeners and viewers on whatever happens next. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.